Good morning, and welcome to the second annual Family Engagement Leadership Summit. It's going to be a really good day. We're glad that you've chosen to spend your day with your colleagues from Ohio and across the nation, with our distinguished presenters, and with our team here at The Ohio State University. My name is Barbara Boone, and I lead the Family Engagement Team at the Center on Education and Training for Employment at Ohio State. And we are Ohio's federally funded statewide Family Engagement Center. Today's a day where we're going to live out our mission to equip, to inspire, to empower families, schools, and our community partners to work together on behalf of our children for their education and for their well-being. It truly takes all of us working together in our different roles to give our children, all of our children, the supports they need to reach their best and brightest futures. This is going to be a really good day because we will all have several excellent opportunities to learn new ways of developing and sustaining authentic, effective partnerships with families. Our team listens to families, to teachers, to district and school administrators in Ohio, and we've heard from you that your deep concern for the well-being of our children and youth, particularly concerned for their mental health as they navigate uncharted waters in education. And today, you can choose sessions with experts who will provide you with information and resources to chart new territories for working together with families, schools, and communities to support our children's mental health. We heard that you need a new map, a new direction for connecting with and learning from families who are new to America, who have low income levels, whose language or culture or race is not recognized, celebrated, or valued in your community. We all can see that we're not yet adept at building trust and strong communication with families of all of our students. And today, you can choose sessions with experts who will provide you with information and resources to chart new territories for building real, effective partnerships with all families. We heard from our families, our schools, and our community partners that in times of transition, say from remote learning to learning in the school building or from preschool to kindergarten, from school to work, that these are times of stress, sometimes worry, and too often times when our children decline in their learning or their motivation or their confidence. And today you may choose sessions with researchers and other experts to give you a map for a new direction in your approaches to working together with your communities, your schools, and your families to make transition times in our children's lives times when they can excel. They'll have hope. They'll feel confident and know that they can navigate these waters of change because they have a sea of supporters around them who are working together to help them be their best selves. And finally, today is our day for you to develop your skills for leading family engagement in your education system. We need strong leaders who know how to hear the perspectives of families, to bring families into leadership in our education systems, to build strong programs of engagement that are shaped by and embrace the values, the cultures, the races, and languages of our students and their families. A new highlight of this summit this year is a session for everyone where we're going to learn from parents and caregivers from Ohio who are leaders for education of the children in their communities. We're also going to have a special sessions highlighting schools in Ohio that are doing phenomenal work to make change in their practices towards creating opportunities for all families, towards creating and to engage in their children's education. And we know for certain that all children can learn, that what we look like, where we live, how much our family earns should not determine how smart our children can be. Today, we hope that you identify in your own work and your own interactions with students and their families those practices that are not effective. Today, we're charting new territories. We're taking the learnings from the past year and from research, and we're moving forward. Today, I hope you will commit to discontinuing old ways of ineffective compliance, family engagement, that only gives some students and families opportunities, and instead commit to learn new ways of how to partner together with families, all families in high school, middle school, and elementary school. Let's not go back to family engagement as it was done way back in 2019. We have a chance to revolutionize education, take giant leaps rather than baby steps towards building homeschool community supports for each and every child. We have a chance to give family, school, and community engagement for education a new direction. Now, before I go any further, I want to stop and recognize some people who work hard every day on your behalf. It's our team here at Ohio State. Each day I get to spend my time working with this very committed, very talented, and really productive and innovative team. I'm going to say their names here, and I hope that you will seek out these folks when you are in sessions and that you will get a chance to thank them and to recognize them and to connect with them. I want to start with Thomas Capretta because Tom really is our lead organizer on this entire day. He works on it all year long. If it wasn't for Tom, we wouldn't have this special summit. And so a special thanks to Thomas Capretta on our team. I also want to thank Dr. Meredith Wellman. I hope you'll seek her out. Kristen Neek-Hennon, Hadley Bachman, Patrick Cunningham, Beth Crawford, Dr. Kenyana Walker, Jessica Hurt, Farah Allen, Greg Nagy, and James Riley. These team members are going to have OSU after their name in the chat, or they're going to have the word moderator after their name. That'll be an easy way to find them. I'm glad that you're going to get to meet many of our team members today, along with our other new colleagues. Please take the time today to learn, but also to make connections with others that you get to meet, albeit virtually, so that you can connect and continue to learn from each other after today. Well, now I have the pleasure of introducing to you Dr. Ana Paula Correa, who is the Director of the Center on Education and Training for Employment and is really a champion for our work. Dr. Correa is a professor of learning technologies in the Department of Educational Studies at The Ohio State University, and she leads the Learning and Experience Design Research Group, a group dedicated to investigating learning, design, processes, and pedagogies to create deep learning. Dr. Correa, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Barbara Boone, and thank you everyone that are joining us this morning. I'm going to try to follow Dr. Boone's passionate opening remarks with a very short welcome message. Again, my name is Ana Paula Correa, and I'm with absolute delight to be here with you this morning. I want to welcome everyone to the second annual Ohio Family Engagement Leadership Summit. This year, the theme of the summit is exploring new areas and new ways in family engagement. And it could not come at a better time. And you could not be in better hands than with Dr. Boone, our team, and our excellent lineup of guest speakers as they take us on explorations in mental health, transitions, leadership, opportunity for all in the context of family engagement. And I did share with you in the beginning that this will be a very short opening remarks. I just want to congratulate everyone, the organizing team, as well as the presenters and attendees at this event. I wish you all a very inspiring and productive day at this virtual summit. And this is all from me. Thank you. Enjoy it, because I'm already enjoying it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Correa. Well, everyone working for change and who is charting new territories needs champions like Dr. Correa. And at OSU, we are blessed to have a state superintendent of public instruction who is a champion for our work. State Superintendent Paulo De Maria and the Ohio Department of Education have been our partners for many years. They provide excellent leadership and support for our Ohio educators, our students and families through their tireless work. Superintendent De Maria is a leader who has cast a vision for Ohio's education system that is indeed charting new territories. Please join me in welcoming Superintendent De Maria.
Thank you so much, Barbara. It's just a great joy and pleasure for me to be with you all today for the second annual Ohio Family Engagement Leadership Summit. I love the theme that Barbara has articulated and Dr. Correa as well about new directions, exploring new ways in terms of family engagement. And this idea of let's not go back, but let's really chart the course for what the future holds in terms of really strong, robust, and meaningful family engagement. I want to start by just thanking each and every one of you. It looks like we have a tremendous crowd that has joined this conference, this webinar. And I know you have choices about where you could be on this Friday morning and for most of the day today. And I just am ever so appreciative of your willingness to say, I'm going to take time out of my busy schedule and prioritize my own growth, my own learning about the emerging issues and family engagement. And boy, what a robust agenda you have. You have so many great experts that you're going to be hearing from, so many great ideas. I always love the fact that on a webinar or conference like this, that you're going to hear from real world practitioners who are actually doing the things that we want more and more people to do. It's those kind of practices that are not only research-based, but actually showing real results on the ground that I think are always so inspiring. When we wrote the state strategic plan, Each Child, Our Future, obviously we put at the center the whole child, knowing that our shared obligation was to meet the needs of the whole child if we expect children to reach the vision that we have for them to be challenged, prepared, and empowered. And one of the strategies in the strategic plan, or I should say one of the core principles, is really this notion of partnership. And those of you who have heard me speak before know that I am used to saying educating the children of the state of Ohio is everyone's business. It's everyone's business. Certainly the education community stands, at a focal point of that business. And parents stand at a most important focal point of that. But everybody has to be brought to the table. And I think this notion of the work that Ohio Statewide Family Engagement Center under Dr. Boone's leadership and with her amazing staff has really continued to emphasize how do we really create strong family engagement. Because what we do see is time and time and time again, that kind of engagement can have a hugely powerful impact on the educational experience and the educational outcomes for our students. I'm reminded, during the earliest parts of the pandemic, one of the things that I found so encouraging was a renewed vigor, a renewed effort, out of necessity, frankly, for schools to connect with households, for teachers to connect with parents, for those relationships to be strengthened, for communication to be increased like 10 times, 20 times as much as it was happening beforehand. And that those communications really built a stronger understanding between parents and teachers of the circumstances of the student. It built a stronger collaboration around helping the student in their academic pursuits. Each other gained a better understanding of the other. So teachers better understood the parent perspective, parents better understood the teacher's perspective. And at the end of the day, they also shared a common outcome, and that was helping that student reach their fullest potential, reach those high levels of expectation that we know are necessary for those students to be prepared to go on for future success. One of the other things that we emphasized in the strategic plan was this idea of meeting the needs of the whole child. And so many of those needs are needs that are provided jointly between school and family, but also between school, family, and other community partners. In our strategy 7, the work that resulted from that emphasis on meeting the needs of the whole child was really another thing that I'm very proud of, and that's our whole child framework. Hopefully some of you are familiar with that. And the whole child framework basically is an organizing structure that says, here are the major components of what makes up those needs that the child may have that go beyond their academic needs. And in the graphic representation of those needs, you'll see a circle around the entirety of it that really represents the family and the power that that family engagement brings to addressing the nutritional needs of children, the healthcare needs of children, the mental health care needs of children, the safety of children, and on and on and on down the list of the elements of the whole child framework. Because again, what that framework represents is really this shared desire and shared commitment on behalf of everyone that interacts with the child to be attentive to those needs, because we know that if a child isn't, if those needs aren't met, then when they're in an academic learning experience, they're not going to be at their best. And they're not going to be able to fully leverage that academic experience and take full advantage of it in terms of their experience in acquiring knowledge and skills that go on to lead them to future success. And so that's why I'm so encouraged by the great turnout we have today, because each and every one of you in the work you do each day is really committed to the strength of that partnership and the impact it can have on the learning experiences for our children. And for that, I celebrate. And I applaud you for the great work you do and the continuing learning, because I think we do really great work in Ohio, but there's continual room for improvement. And these kinds of conferences help us to leverage that improvement. And which is why I want to end by really sort of making an ask of you. As you go through today's session, I want you to be very deliberate about thinking about what you hear and about how that might apply to the work you do. And making a short list for yourself. It doesn't have to be, a dozen items, maybe even one or two things that you commit to doing differently or trying to do differently. And it could be as simple as, hey, I'm going to take back this idea that I learned to the group that I work with in my school or district or at my ESC or at my community organization, and just talk with my staff or with others, with my peers about this particular idea that I learned. Or maybe I was really impressed by this person's presentation. I'm going to follow up with that person. I'm going to get their contact information and have a deeper discussion to better understand what they were doing. Maybe it was a school or district doing some really outstanding thing, and you think, oh, we could do that in my place if I really understood a few more nuances. And so you follow up. Maybe you see someone else on the call that's asking really great questions, and you say, oh, I want to network with that person because I think some of the same questions they're having are questions that I'm struggling with. And so maybe you do that. So or you may say, hey, the statewide center is really doing some cool work around evidence-based practices. I'm gonna create a stronger relationship with Barbara or some of her team members to really gain increased access to knowledge and evidence-based practices that might be valuable to me. So take an opportunity to not only be careful in terms of your listening and your note taking, but then to make a commitment that you're going to do something, take action, right? With your peers, with your staff, in your school. And sometimes we know that trying new things may not always work out the first time. So many times we try new things and it doesn't go really well, but many times it doesn't go well, but there's a glimmer of what it could be. And you keep improving, you keep refining until you really realize, hey, this is powerful stuff and this can really make a great difference. Because I've got to tell you, time and time and time again, when we see parents and families working closely with teachers and school administrators and really focused on that shared desire for the great academic outcomes and successes that our students can achieve, that those actually make a huge difference. And I think that's what encourages me about the work of the statewide center. That's what encourages me about conferences like this, where individuals like you step forward and say, I can be an enabler of this work. I can be one that makes a difference, and we can all have a greater impact on many, many more students. Because ultimately that's our goal. It's not good enough for 75% or 80% of our students. The reason we named our strategic plan Each Child, Our Future is because at the end of the day, our obligation needs to be for each child. And there are too many of those each childs that we still need to do more for in order to position them for success in life. And I appreciate your commitment to that end. So again, thanks for allowing me to make a few brief comments here. I hope you enjoy this conference. You've got an exciting agenda. I hope you make a commitment to take some specific action. And I am so very grateful. Keep up the great work you do each and every day for Ohio's children. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Superintendent De Maria. Please join me in thanking him in the chat as well. Well, years ago, I heard an engaging, thoughtful, and unapologetic advocate for education for children and families speak at a conference here in Columbus. And I was so eager to learn more that when I overheard that he was going to call an Uber for a ride to the airport, I leaned in and offered him a ride myself. And I really enjoyed the opportunity to pick his brain about some of the points he'd made. And he was very gracious in answering my questions. And I'm sure he was probably exhausted and probably pretty relieved when I dropped him off at the airport. And that was Dr. Gorski. Dr. Paul Gorski is the founder of Equity Literacy Institute and EdChange, and he has more than 20 years of experience helping educators, nonprofit workers, and others strengthen their equity efforts. He's published many articles and books, including Reaching and Teaching Students in Poverty, Strategies for Erasing the Opportunity Gap, which is one of my favorites. Dr. Gorski was a teacher educator for several universities for 15 years, and he is now also a new father. I'm thrilled for you all to have the opportunity to meet Dr. Gorski today as he delivers our keynote message, and I hope you will listen well and look for those new territories for building partnerships and build trust with the families of all students. Welcome, Dr. Gorski.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and good morning, everybody. Great to see so many people on, zooming in here on a Friday morning. How amazing and wonderful. I'm going to do a screen share so I can put up my my PowerPoint. I'm trying, to figure out how I can detach from the PowerPoints, but so far I haven't managed yet. I think I might need to get some emotional support for that process. But so, what wonderful comments, everybody there at the beginning. And Barbara, I really loved you used a phrase that just sort of perked me up, and it was, I think if I'm capturing it right, I think you referred to a sea of support. And I just loved that, the idea of sort of a sea of support, sort of the bigness of it and the strength of it, and the way that it challenges this kind of traditional notion that we have that really support is just about individual people supporting individual other people, and that's all we need in order to create. Well, what I'm interested in is equity. So all we need to create equitable learning environments, when really we need a reimagining. We need sort of a institutional and individual reimagining and ideological shifts to get us where we need to be. So I titled my session here, Reimagining Family Engagement with an Equity Lens. Again, my interest here is, how do we take equity as sort of a lens or a filter to inform what we're doing across education and really across society? And that's what this, when we apply that lens, that equity lens to family engagement, what does that, what does that look like? My primary area of expertise, in fact, is actually equity and justice. That's my primary lens for things. And I apply that to all sorts of things in my work with the Equity Literacy Institute. But I think the conversation about family engagement is one of those conversations that has historically, I think, kind of lacked a strong central equity focus. So I'm going to provide some ideas and tools for that, and then at the end share a few sort of maybe more practical suggestions. But I want to begin just by sharing some starting assumptions here, so you can understand where I'm coming from in my equitable approach to this. So here's my first assumption, and if you can agree with this assumption, please just type a Y or yes into the chat box. My first assumption is all families deserve access to equitable educational opportunity. Racial identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, none of these things should determine what level of access people receive. Looks like we can agree on that. And I'm pretty sure if you don't agree on that, then you would not be admitting that publicly in the chat box. So that's starting assumption number one. All families deserve equitable educational opportunity. That's a philosophical, belief or assumption. Part of the problem is just having that philosophical belief gets us nowhere. The question is, how do we put that into action? My second assumption is, due to bias and inequity, not all families do have that equitable access. Is that something we can agree on? Due to bias and inequity, access is not equally or equitably distributed. And the important part of this is the problem there is the bias and the inequities. The problem there is not the families. I'm going to talk a lot about this over the course of my session here. I think one of the biggest ideological barriers when it comes to family engagement and how educators think of family engagement is thinking about it through a lens of there's something we have to fix about families so that they will engage more. And I think that's especially true when the families are families of color, immigrant families, families who are learning English, families that are experiencing poverty, and so on. That there's so much focus on how do we convince them to value their kids' education, or how do we coach them, or maybe we need parenting classes and these sorts of things. And all of these solutions that are very common solutions for increasing family engagement, which actually in the end, I think have more negative impact than positive impact. And I'll talk more about that. The third starting assumption is we can't control everything. There are some barriers to some kinds of family engagement that we have no control over, such as biases and inequities. You know, if you really want to get involved in something that would strengthen family engagement, then support living wage laws. That would probably be the most important thing any of us could do. Support living wage laws so that each adult, each working age person in a family could have one job, 40 hours a week that pays a living wage, so that we don't have families having to get 3 jobs, 4 jobs, just in order to be able to raise their families. That's probably the biggest impact we could have. On the other hand, in my role as an educator, I don't have control over that. In my role as a citizen, I can be engaged in that. But in my role as an educator, that's a little bit outside my sphere of influence. I can't just, wave a magic wand and now every family has working transportation so that they can come to the school for some family engagement activity. I don't have control over that necessarily. But I do have the power to decide, in whatever my sphere of influence is, that I'm not going to recreate those biases and inequities. I also have the power to be responsive to those barriers. I might not be able to buy every family a car, but I can reimagine the ways that we're doing family engagement or, school family partnerships in ways that take into account the fact that some of our families do not have working transportation. I can take that into account. I could take into account the fact that because of economic injustice, we have parents who are working 3 jobs, just to make ends meet, which makes it a lot more difficult for them to come to the parent-teacher conference, or might even make it difficult for them to spend a lot of time, helping their children with homework or whatever the kind of engagement we're looking for. But in order to make sure that I'm not replicating those biases and inequities, we need a deep understanding of how those things operate, including subtle, sometimes even unintentional ways that they operate. Okay. So deep understanding of equity, and we'll talk about that more in a second too. I start with the assumption that we all have good intentions, that we want the best for each family. I start with that assumption. Now, I also recognize that I'm extending a benefit of the doubt here, because I do think it's naive. I do think it's naive to believe that if you work in a school or a school district, I do think it's naive to believe that everyone who works in education, that we can assume by virtue of them working in education that they want the best for each student. There are bigots working in education. There are racists. There are homophobes. There are transphobes. Maybe not people running around screaming the N-word, but certainly there are people working in education, and maybe even people working in this call, who don't necessarily want equity to be distributed. So I think that's true. But I'm going to start in the context of this session with the assumption that we all have good intentions. So I'm not going to try to convince you that we ought to be fighting racism or sexism or xenophobia and how that operates through family engagement kinds of things. I'm just going to assume you're with me in terms of being horrified that stuff exists, and that we're going to start with that assumption and talk about, okay, well, what do we need to do about it? Because the sixth starting assumption is good intentions mean squat when there aren't good actions underlying the good intentions. Good intentions, who cares? Doesn't matter if you have good intentions if we're not channeling those into good actions. So part of what we're going to talk about this morning is, well, what are good actions when it comes to family engagement? What are equitable and just actions? You know, this is also really important in this day and age, because I think because of all of the protests and Black Lives Matter and those sorts of things that are happening right now, that there's a lot of pressure in education to create the optics of equity. And I think people are really good. And I think it's, in some ways, I think it's easier to get a job as a school or district leader if I'm really good at creating the optics of equity. I think it's easier to get a job if I'm good at creating the optics of equity than it is if I'm good at actually creating equity. That's my experience working with schools and districts, that the optics are rewarded more than the actual work. The actual work is often punished while the optics are rewarded. Yeah. So we got to check ourselves on that. We got to check ourselves on that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so here's I call this the equity literacy equation. I use a framework called equity literacy. It's about how do we strengthen our literacy when it comes to equity. We want literacy to become our lens, right? We don't want it to think about it as like a program, like we're pulling equity out of the filing cabinet occasionally and just applying it to something. We want it to be a lens that informs everything we do. And to me, that's actually a bit of a relief, because I think, you know, when I work with educators and they say, well, they're telling me I have to do social emotional and I have to do trauma informed, and we're doing restorative practices and circles. And then now you're telling me I also have to do equity. And I say, no. What we want to do is make sure all of those things we're doing equitably. You know, that's the idea. So this is the equation. One is goodwill, the desire for justice. I got to have the desire for equity and justice. But I can't just have that. I also have to have that depth of knowledge, how inequity operates and how to cultivate equity. I'm going to talk about some examples specific to family engagement in a bit. And then I need what I call will. That's a commitment to action, not just to belief. We're going to talk about this later, but there's actually research that shows that I talk about this in my book about poverty. There's this research where families that are experiencing poverty explain why they're less likely to visit their children's schools for various kinds of engagement, at school engagement, than other families. And there's kind of two buckets of reasons for that. I'm going to talk about the other bucket later, but one of the buckets is how they're treated when they do engage with their children's school. So this is about will, commitment to action. How are people held accountable in your school or district? How are teachers who are doing damage to people held accountable? How are they held accountable? Are we just assuming everyone has good intentions? Or are we understanding that some people, even with good intentions, are still doing damage? You know, families experiencing poverty, often families of color, communities of color, have experienced generations of what can feel like disdain and contempt from educators, from their kids' schools. Right? Not that any of us individually are intending that, but we don't have to intend it for it to be the case. If we don't fix that, then we might as well not have this conversation, because that's the barrier. You know, that's one of the big barriers. So commitment to action, what are we doing about that? It's not just better communication styles, it's what are we doing to eliminate the bias and the inequity that's putting these walls between communities that are historically and presently marginalized and us as educators. So A quick preview of the rest of what we're going to do. I'm already behind, darn it. Okay, so I'm going to do a really quick intro to equity. I'm going to talk about a couple of big myths about family engagement and the shifts to the realities. I'm going to talk about deficit ideology, which I think is the biggest ideological barrier. And then what can we do differently? So just really quickly, because I keep using the word equity, what the heck do I mean? So let's start by defining inequity. I think of inequity as the unfair distribution of, or unjust distribution of access and opportunity that results in both outcome and experience disparities that are usually pretty predictable across things like race, class. You know, the disparities that exist in education generally exist in virtually every school in the country, and they're generally pretty predictable. And schools that have any kind of racial diversity, generally speaking, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students are suspended or expelled at higher rates than white students. So we know that to be the case. Actually, research even tells us why that happens. We know that happens primarily because teachers interpret subjective behaviors of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students more harshly than they interpret the exact same behaviors in white students. Research has shown unequivocally that that is the primary cause of those discipline disparities. And that's pretty predictable. But let me just share this example, because I'm going to use another example that's specific to family engagement about this later. The problem, and again, this is just going to be a metaphor for example I'll use later, specific to family engagement. The ideological problem is that we know, for instance, Black students are more likely to be suspended. We know the cause of that. That is mostly teacher bias and how subjective behaviors are interpreted and punished. But how are most schools trying to solve that discipline disparity? Most of the most popular strategies for addressing that discipline disparity are about adjusting the behaviors of Black students, or adjusting the attitudes or the emotions of Black students, which is actually a racist response to a problem of racism. And we have sort of the same issue with family engagement. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. That's that deficit ideology I'm going to talk about. Outcome and experience disparities. We want to make sure in this day and age in education, people are obsessed with collecting quantitative data and looking at comparisons, and that's a really important thing to do. But it's an incomplete thing to do. And just an example of this, we might have data about which parents attend at-school opportunities for family engagement. We might have data about that. And we might be able to look at that data and say, oh, goodness, our families whose kids are using free and reduced lunch program are less likely, or our families who are learning English are less likely, or whatever. And that's an important thing. But we also want to look at experience disparities. Like I said, families experiencing poverty report that their biggest barrier, one of their two biggest barriers to going to visit their kids' school is how they're treated when they're at that school. So we also have to collect data about that. If we don't fix that, the experience disparity, then we really have no shot at fixing the outcome disparity. Okay. So we want to look at both experience and outcome disparities. I'm going to skip this, even though it's really important. We also have in the equity literacy framework a thing that we call basic principles of equity literacy. There's a bunch of them. There's an article that you can look up online and access for free. It's called Avoiding Racial Equity Detours, that summarizes these principles. All of them, but just a couple of them. A couple of basic principles of equity. First principle is equity requires that we prioritize the interests of families whose interests we historically have failed to prioritize. That's that deeper level of equality versus equity. How are we prioritizing? So what that means is if we know that, for instance, with at-school family engagement, that families experiencing poverty are less likely to attend those things, how would we reimagine our family engagement efforts in ways that prioritize the interests of those families? Because middle-class families can adjust to however we do it. But the lowest income families cannot adjust to us doing, creating mechanisms for family engagement that presume that everybody is middle class. That's the prioritization principle. So if you really want to make equity-based shifts, you say, okay, well, who are the families that we've had the least amount of effective, productive engagement with? Now let's reimagine our family engagement efforts based around their needs and their interests. That's the difference between equality and equity. Equality is we'll keep doing what we're doing and we'll try to squeeze those families into it. Equity is some families have this level of access and some families have that level of access. Equity is about eliminating the disparity in access. The only possible way to do that is to prioritize the needs of the families who have been cheated out of equitable access. Prioritize them until we have some sort of level playing field. The second principle, and we'll go back to these through the rest of the session, is called the ideology principle. Shifts in practice are not sustainable without shifts in ideology. In other words, if I have a school full of teachers who have racial biases or class biases or xenophobic biases, it doesn't matter what strategies for family engagement I put in place, because what they're going to be operationalizing are their biases. In the same way, I can't, giving a teacher who has prejudices about people experiencing poverty 5 strategies for teaching people experiencing poverty, that's a completely meaningless. It's going to have no impact. What we have to do is address the biases. And again, as I mentioned, for families experiencing poverty specifically, that one of the barriers is how they're treated when they visit their kids' school. Same, by the way, with families of color. There's this research that shows, for instance, that when white families come to school to advocate for their children, when white parents, they're more likely to be seen, even if they're being strong and aggressive and determined about it, they're more likely to be seen as good advocates for their kids and that sort of thing. But those same behaviors are interpreted much differently when it's Black parents coming in to advocate strongly for their kids, where they might be seen as troublemakers. They might be seen as militant. They might be labeled in a way white families aren't labeled. Right? If we don't fix that, then why would those families want to engage with us? Why would they want to engage with institutions that are marginalizing them and their children? So that's the first step. That's the first step. But we have to make those ideological shifts. So any kind of professional development around family engagement that's supposed to address some of these disparities should not just be about strategies. They have to be about ideology. They have to be about, well, if you have really the truth is, in schools and in school districts and organizations that are committed to equity, they should be hiring people committed to equity. That's something that should be fixed in the hiring process, really, more than anything. But if we have the problem now, then we need to make those ideological shifts, not just practical shifts. So we define equity as both a commitment to action. That's the process of redistributing access and opportunity. So the question is, what actions are we taking? What are the actions we're taking to inform family engagement efforts with this equity and justice, right? How are we holding people accountable for the ways that they might be marginalizing families? How are we shifting the ways we do things to prioritize the interests of people who have been cheated? What are we doing specifically? And then it's a way of being, the state of being free of bias, discrimination. That's the more sort of aspirational way. So we think about, okay, how do we think about family engagement in a way that is free of how do we claw our way toward an approach that is, that does that? Well, I think the first thing we have to do is take on some of the big myths. And again, these are also sort of ideological shifts. Two big myths and even bigger realities that in my experience working with schools and districts are often big holdups. One is family engagement is the most important factor in student achievement. It absolutely is not. There are many, many factors which are more important than family engagement. This is a myth that is often propagated by neoliberal education reform movements. They're all over, Heritage Foundation, Hoover Institution, these kinds of organizations. It's actually just not true that family engagement is the most important factor. There's never been a study that determined it is the most important factor. It's just a thing people say. But what's interesting about it is my experience is that the purpose of this line of this presumption, of this popular presumption, is not really about necessarily educators, but it's about families. Because if I can convince people family engagement is the most important factor, then I can just blame families for not being engaged if their kids aren't doing well in school. It's got nothing to do about equitable access. It's got nothing to do about how they're treated in school. It's got nothing to do with anything like that. It's just those families aren't engaged in their kids' education. Those families aren't engaged. It's a very clever way, if I want resources to be distributed how they've been distributed historically, to blame families of color for educational disparities. They're not engaged enough. Blame low-income families. They're not engaged enough. Right? It's a trick that has happened. It doesn't mean it's not important, and I would never argue that. It is important. It's critically important, not just for student achievement, but just for good communication and good relationships. But it's not the most important factor. It's not the most important factor. Myth number 2 is that socioeconomic status, race, immigrant status, those sorts of things are good predictors of the extent to which families value education. In other words, people often say families experience, when I ask a question like, we know it's a fact that students who are experiencing poverty don't do as well in school on average as their wealthier peers. Why is that the case? Or if I say families who are experiencing poverty are less likely to visit their kids' schools than wealthier families. Why is that the case? And often the presumption is, well, families experiencing poverty just don't value education the way other families do. Or families that are learning English just don't value education as much as other families do. And so again, that misinforms our approach to solving those problems. And here's the reality. Again, I list all this in my book. There's never been a single study that showed that any particular group of people value education less. Every single study has looked across race, that has looked across class, that has looked across language, that has looked across immigrant status, have all found the same thing, which is everybody values education. So when we look at these disparities and we're trying to make sense of them, we have to make sure we don't fall into that trap. Say, oh, well, we have to convince these families to value education. We don't have to convince anybody to value education because everybody values education. That's basically what the research shows. Everybody values education. I think a harder question we could ask ourselves, again, for those of you who work in education, is, do we as an education community value everybody's education equally? And if we did, then we would eliminate the barriers that we construct that might create some of the disparities in family engagement. It's just a little different way to look at it. It's just a little different way to look at it there, right? Okay. So again, I start with the assumption we all have good intentions. The question is, what are we doing with those intentions? I mean, that's the harder question, right? That's the harder question, right? So this is what I want to challenge you to do throughout this conference, through all the sessions you do, is that how can I look at this just a little bit more deeply? How can I not just sort of buy into the traditional way of looking at this and look at it more deeply? This is an excerpt from my book where I cite, all the studies about who values education differently. So we call this, oh gosh, I need to start skipping some stuff. So we call this notion that there's this term called deficit ideology. Basically what it refers to is, deficit ideology refers, well, let me just skip a few. Deficit ideology is a belief system that locates the primary cause of educational disparities, whether those are test score gaps, behavior referral, special ed referral disproportionality, graduation rates, that locates the primary cause of disparities within marginalized communities. Okay. If you want a real simple example of deficit ideology in action, we know in schools we have all these racial disparities related to just about everything in education. Also, what we know is that all across the country, schools are embracing grit initiatives. Grit. We got to help students be more gritty and resilient. The fact that there are more schools responding to racial disparities with grit initiatives than there are schools responding to racial disparities with anti-racist initiatives, that demonstrates deficit thinking. If we can just help these students be more gritty, they can do better. Okay, so this is the shift that we have to make. The belief system that locates educational disparities within marginalized communities. You hear deficit ideology all the time if you work in education. Those parents don't care about their children's education. Those kids who live in such and such neighborhood don't have any role models at home. If we don't hold those students accountable, they'll never learn responsibility. Those parents don't even want to learn English. The LGBTQI students don't want to be bullied. If they don't want to be bullied, they shouldn't throw their sexual orientations in other students' faces. We hear this all the time in education. It's prevalent in education. Education is soaking in deficit ideology. We're just drenched in it. It's all over the place in education. So we have to learn how to hear it. And we have to learn how to address it. And it's impacting family engagement. One, because it's causing us to come up with solutions to disparities in family engagement that are about fixing families rather than about eliminating barriers. And because deficit ideology has us pointing scorn at families that are already marginalized. Why would they want to engage with us? I'm just going to give you a quick example of this. I was working with a school in Wisconsin, and this school has a big population of Hmong refugee students, families of people who immigrated to Wisconsin, Hmong families, and their children. Had a big population of their children. So I'm meeting with the principal, and the principal is saying, you know, we collected this data about who's participating in extracurriculars, and what we found was that our Hmong students are the ones who are least likely to participate in extracurriculars. And he shows me the data, and he says, doesn't that prove that they're less engaged in education, that they value education less than other students? Why aren't they engaging in all these educational opportunities? So I said, well, let's explore that. Are there any possible explanations for Hmong students not participating in extracurriculars other than they don't value education? Is there any other possible explanation for that? So, you know, he kind of struggled through that conversation. Later, I had a focus group with Hmong students, and later than that with Hmong families. And both of those focus groups, I brought up that question. And from among students, what I heard was basically, why would I want to spend one extra minute in this school? I'm treated in this school like a second-class citizen. Why would I want to spend any more time here than I already have to spend here? And if you think about the principal's ideology, the principal's set of presumptions when it comes to those kids, you could say, well, yeah, the person with the most power in this school talks about these kids with contempt. That's deficit ideology, right? So his solution was going to be, well, we got to convince these families that this is important. So think about how he's engaging with those families with the presumption that they don't value education. That's not going to help them want to engage. That's not the solidarity that we're looking for. It actually had the opposite effect. Right? So that's the danger. That's the practical danger of deficit ideology. Okay. So there are sort of what we call three ideologies, attribution ideologies. How do we make sense of educational disparities? I just talked about deficit ideology. Grit ideology is a kind of deficit ideology, which attributes disparities to a lack of grit or resilience. What we want is what's called an equity ideology. Equity ideology is about really being focused on what are the challenges and barriers. What are the challenges and barriers to family engagement? What are the challenges and barriers that exist outside of school? What are the challenges and barriers that exist in the school? What are the challenges and barriers that we're creating with our own ideological blockages? Okay. So the only way to address these disparities, my argument would be, the best way to increase, what I like to call school, family, community solidarity. The best way to increase that is to identify and eliminate the bias and the inequity, identify and eliminate the racism. Because you can do all the things you want to do. If those families are still experiencing racism in your school, then there's not going to be solidarity. If those families are still being condescended to when they come to visit their kids' school, even by educators who don't even realize they're being condescending, then we're not really fixing the underlying issue. So this is a shift. This is how we look at things structurally, not just individually. Okay, I got to jump ahead again. So how we might unintentionally undermine family engagement with a deficit ideology. I talked about this before. Families experiencing poverty report two big categories of reasons they're less likely to visit their kids' school than wealthier families. Neither of them has anything to do with them valuing education or wanting to be engaged. What are they? Well, I mentioned that one of the buckets is how they're treated. The other bucket is really about access and opportunity. I don't have transportation. I work multiple jobs. I don't have paid leave. Think about the resource that paid leave is, right? Can't afford childcare if I need childcare to visit my kid's school. I'm working 3 jobs because we don't have living wage jobs in a country that can afford to have living wage laws, right? Okay, so with an equity lens, we might ask, how might we reimagine family engagement approaches in ways that prioritize the interests of families experiencing poverty, of families learning English? If you want a great exercise, we don't have time to do it right now. We don't have time to do it right now, but just an exercise you could do. To say, okay, we're just going to forget everything we know about family engagement. And let's put a group. It could be Latinx people, it could be whoever, but let's just say families experiencing poverty. So forget everything we know, families experiencing poverty. How do we construct an approach to family engagement that prioritizes their interests? Just do that as an exercise, because otherwise what we end up doing is basically keeping what we have and then just opening little narrow pathways, trying to squeeze people into an inequitable approach. And then the other question is, what is the pre-work we would need to do to pull this off equitably? What is the ideological work? What are the ideological shifts that we need? I just want to mention here really quickly, someone's mentioning the Bridges Out of Poverty training. The Bridges Out of Poverty training is actually built on a deficit ideology. The whole thing about families experiencing poverty have a mindset or a culture that's bogus. That is just not true. There is no mindset of poverty. That's just something somebody made up. People experiencing poverty do not share a mindset or a culture. The problem with that also is it's very individualistic in nature. If we just surround one person experiencing poverty with middle-class people, we might help them, behave more like a middle-class person and get out of poverty. Poverty doesn't exist because of individual people's mindsets or cultures. It exists because of big structural conditions that create economic injustice, like a lack of living wage laws, like wealth inequality and those sorts of things. So again, we have to be very careful about not embracing these very sort of individualistic, presumptuous approaches. So I'm glad that came up in the chat box, same with the Circles program. Really quickly, just to end here, I know I'm already a minute over, just really quickly, what can we do? One, presume families are already engaged. Vast majority are. And don't spend energy trying to fix a problem that doesn't exist. Those families don't value education enough. That's a problem that doesn't exist. So our approach for family engagement and that solidarity should not be about trying to fix that issue. Focus on relationship building and trust building rather than engagement events or engagement instances. From an anti-bias and equity point of view, that means addressing bias and inequity honestly, directly, and institutionally. Address it directly, honestly, and institutionally. Not just the optics of it. Identify the racism, eliminate the racism, actively cultivate anti-racism. If we want strong relationships between schools and communities of color, that's an important avenue there. And if we skip that step, then we're just not going to cultivate the trust. Or, by the way, if we put the responsibility on communities of color to fix the racism in schools rather than the institutions itself fixing it, that's another way to lose trust. Provide resources and supports for at-home family engagement, which is where the most important family engagement happens. Make sure the resources are engaging and interactive. So what I'm talking about there is not sending home a list of websites or a worksheet, but other sorts of resources. And some of you are already doing an awesome job of that. Listen, listen, listen. Family engagement is about me as an educator listening rather than telling and dictating. Again, I'm sure most of you are already doing that, and that's why you're attending a session like this. Purposeful, persistent outreach without presumption. I'm not just reaching out, reporting something awful has happened. I'm not just reaching out once, the one and done. I'm always ensuring a collegial tone, and I'm not assuming anything if somebody doesn't respond immediately. Again, using the example of families experiencing poverty, some of them, pay for phone access by minutes. They buy chunks of minutes. And if they run out of minutes, they can't necessarily afford to reload the minutes. So sometimes there are reasonable reasons. And also, again, if somebody has felt condescended to, they might be less likely to respond. That's why we want to be consistent and persistent and keep reaching out collegial tone. Take bias concerns seriously. It happens way too often that, let's say a Black parent comes in and, my child has been experiencing racial bias, and then to have that be invalidated or minimized or softened, that sort of thing. And again, that creates a barrier. Why would that family trust us after that, right? Demonstrate deep equity commitment. I already talked about some of this. That last point is a point about getting rid of that deficit ideology, embrace an equity ideology. Sorry, again, I know I'm running a little late, but this middle bullet point is really important too. That I think in a lot of schools, celebrating diversity is conflated with creating equity. In some ways, celebrating diversity has got nothing to do with equity. I mean, we can have the multicultural festival every day of the school year. That has no impact on homophobia at the school or racism at the school, right? So we have to make sure when we focus on equity that we're really focusing on equity. Equity, not celebrating diversity. Equity, not some fluffy version of cultural competence. Identify the racism, eliminate the racism, actively cultivate anti-racism. That's what equity looks like. Rethink family engagement events. Are they accessible financially? Are they accessible time-wise? Are they accessible in terms of institutional culture? Just a couple more of these. We can, oh no, this is the last one, sorry. Seek family input. How can we engage with you in ways that will be more constructive for you, more positive for you, more equitable for you? How do we establish trust with you? But seek family input only if you're willing to change our ideology and practice in response to that input. Because too often schools have these listening sessions and then nothing changes. So, and it's irresponsible to have families make themselves vulnerable to do that if we're not willing to change based on what they have to say. So I guess I want to end there. I went a little bit over. But I just want to end by thanking you all. I know it's kind of a precarious time in the world right now, and especially for educators. And right now, really, you know, my sister and her husband are both doctors, work in healthcare. So they're kind of my heroes right now. And educators are my heroes also just because of, you know, what we're dealing with right now, whether you're preschool or higher ed. Thank you for, you know, making yourself vulnerable so the learning can go on. I really respect that and, you know, feel deep love and connection for everyone who's doing that. So enjoy the rest of the sessions and thank you all. And you can get in touch with me here if you want. Let's put my email address in the chat box if anyone wants to reach out.
Perfect. I have a feeling you're going to have just a few emails. Maybe a lot. Thank you so much for your address and for you always challenge me. I always question a little bit and think and examine myself, and I think as professionals that is so important to our work, that we examine and we challenge ourselves. We are not going to grow. We're not going to be able to sort of take on new directions, turn from old ways, turn from myths or stereotypes or things that we just sort of assume, right? Well, we need to sort of challenge those assumptions and to really grow. And once again, you have provided that time for us. So thank you for that. And I also heard you say, you know, believing's not enough. I think caring's not enough, right? Right. That's not it. It's taking action. And I would also say, you know, knowledge is enough. Just knowing things isn't enough. We're changing beliefs, we're reshaping those, we're learning and we're acting. And I really hope that today your keynote kind of really helped us shift into that, and that all of you who are here today listening and clearly really enjoyed and were inspired by that time. So I hope that you will now sort of start thinking about how does that change what you do. And so the work of the heart and the head and now the hands. So thank you for that. You know, at a face-to-face conference, many of you would kind of be waiting, right? You'd be wanting to sort of run up to talk to Dr. Gorski, and or you might even be like me and offer to give him a ride to the airport. But while we can't do that in this virtual conference, we have scheduled an office hour next week with Dr. Gorski for you. If you'd like to spend more time in discussion with Dr. Gorski in an informal session, please join us for an hour with him on next Tuesday, September 21st, from 9 until 10 a.m. The link to register for that time is available on the webpage for today's summit near Dr. Gorski's photo for this morning's session. So I hope that many of you will take advantage of that and ask your questions and go deeper. We hope today's a good day of learning for all of you. And we know that one-time training events are not alone the most effective way for us to really change our beliefs and our practice. And we hope that you're going to want to know more and continue learning with us. So just want to invite you to join our Family Engagement Leaders of Ohio. It's a professional learning community that you can find on our website and join and meet with others regularly. You can also subscribe to our monthly guidance documents that really provide timely family engagement topics that come to your email box once a month. You can subscribe for that on our website as well. Visit our website. You'll see lots of training opportunities and in our professional learning tab, and also new resources. We really add new resources to our website every week. And also connect with us on social media. So now is the time for us to exit this main gathering room. We're going to take a short break, and then we are going to join us for one of our first 5 sessions beginning at 10:15. Here's how it's going to work. To select your next session, join the meeting room, navigate to the main webpage for this conference that was emailed to you, and then select the session title. You'll see it's bold and it's underlined. That is the link. That is how you will enter that room. So the link's in the chat now. The rooms are going to open a few minutes prior to the session, and after a few sessions, then we're going to feature a panel of parent leaders. I hope that you will attend that at 12:15, and I hope that you will engage on Twitter and using our hashtag Charting New Territories. This is going to remind us, and it's going to tell others that we are taking family and community engagement out of the past. We're charting a